Tonight, a ranger searching for a missing backpacker encounters another rescue team already working the mountain. The problem is that team disappeared in 1989. Later, two armed poachers abandon everything to escape one remote drainage, and an empty ranger station appears to still have someone working inside. If you're settling in for the night, get comfortable. And if Ashlight is part of your evening, subscribing is the easiest way to find the next archive. Our first story begins with a missing backpacker in the Colorado mountains. At 2:13 in the morning, I met 4 search and rescue volunteers coming down the east fork of the drainage. They knew the name of the man we were looking for. They knew where his last confirmed tracks had been found. One of them told me they had picked up his trail farther upstream and that we needed to move quickly. I believed them. By sunrise, our incident commander was telling me there had been no second team in that drainage. Then he showed me a photograph taken in 1989. The 4 people in the photograph were the 4 people I had spoken to 6 hours earlier. The search had started the previous afternoon, when Thomas Weller's brother called the park after Thomas failed to come out from a 2-day solo route in western Colorado. Thomas was 46, experienced, and equipped well enough that nobody treated the first few hours as an emergency. His truck was where he had left it, at the trailhead. His permit matched the route his brother gave us. The weather had turned colder than forecast, but we had not had enough snow to bury sign, and there had been no major storm. By 5 that evening, though, we knew he was late enough to justify a full search. Thomas had planned to follow the main trail north along the creek, climb into the upper basin, camp one night, then return by the same route. He wore a blue shell, gray hiking pants, and a dark green pack with a bright yellow rain cover strapped beneath it. He carried trekking poles and a satellite messenger, but the messenger had not checked in since the previous morning. Our incident commander divided the drainage into simple sectors. One team worked the lower trail system. Another checked the upper basin from a different access point. Kira Ames and I were assigned the main drainage from the trailhead to the creek junction, then west slope if we found anything that justified pushing higher. Kira was 34, another park ranger, and one of the people I trusted most on a night search because she did not turn guesses into facts. We started just before dark. Before leaving base, we went through the same things we always did. Radio check, medical gear, extra insulation, batteries, coordinates for the last known point, and a printed photo of Thomas clipped inside my map case. Command had his vehicle secured at the trailhead and had already checked nearby campgrounds and road exits. If Thomas had simply changed plans and walked out somewhere else, we wanted to know before sending people deeper into the mountains. About 2 miles in, near the creek junction, I found a partial boot impression in soft ground beside the trail. It was not enough for a positive identification, but the tread size and direction were consistent with Thomas's boots, and the print headed upstream. We flagged it, photographed it, and radioed the location. Nothing about that was unusual. The temperature dropped after sunset. The creek got louder as everything else went quiet, and our headlamps flattened the forest into whatever happened to be 20 feet in front of us. We moved slowly enough to read the ground. A little before midnight, Kira stopped and pointed through the trees across the creek. 4 lights were moving in a line, not random flashlights, not campers. The spacing was too even. The lights paused together, then moved together the way a search team does when one person is reading terrain and the others are maintaining separation. Kira said, "County team?" There was a secondary access on the east side of the drainage. It was rough, but usable. I assumed another unit had come in from there, and that command had simply not updated us yet. Then my radio picked up a burst of traffic under our normal channel. A male voice said, "4 moving east." It was faint and distorted enough that I could not tell whether it came from our repeater or from another frequency bleeding through. I answered, identified myself, and asked the unit to repeat. Nothing came back. Kira tried once. Same result. We kept moving. Around 1 in the morning, we found another possible boot impression, but it was too damaged to call. The ground on the west side of the creek was steep and loose. On the east side, the drainage split into a narrower fork that climbed toward broken timber and a high bench. At 2 o'clock, Kira dropped back about 50 yards to recheck a patch of mud where she thought she had seen a heel edge. I continued ahead to the creek crossing. That was where I met the 4 people. They came out of the timber on the east side in single file. The first man wore an orange search vest over a dark jacket. He had an external frame pack and a radio clipped high on his chest, with an antenna long enough to reach nearly to his shoulder. The woman behind him carried a paper map inside a clear plastic case. One of the other men had canvas gaiters over his boots. Their lights were warmer and weaker than ours, more yellow than white. But none of that looked impossible. Search and rescue units hold on to gear. Volunteers use what works. I had seen packs older than I was on legitimate operations. They looked cold, tired, and completely ordinary. The first man raised a hand. "You Navarro?" I did not remember giving my name over the radio, but I had transmitted several times that night and assumed he had heard me. I said yes. He asked, "You're on Weller?" That got my attention, but not in the way it should have. Thomas's name had been repeated over the radio for hours. I said, "That's right." The man nodded toward the East Fork. We picked up probable sign above the upper creek. One good print, then partials. He's moving farther in than his route plan. I asked what unit they were with. "County SAR." He said it without hesitation. I asked whether they had checked in with our incident command. "Radio's been bad all night." Again, reasonable. He unfolded his map and pointed to a section above the East Fork. "We're sending Charlie 4 through the upper creek. You and your partner should come east. If Weller's still moving, we can close the distance before daylight." Charlie 4 meant nothing to me. Our search was using named terrain sectors, not an old alphanumeric grid. I asked what map system he was working from. He looked down at the paper as though the question barely mattered. "County sheet." Then he folded it again. "If you hear him, don't wait for us. Keep moving." Behind him, the other 3 searchers stood quietly, watching the timber. Nobody acted strange. Nobody stared too long. Nobody looked dead. That normality is probably why I let the conversation last as long as it did. I told him my partner was behind me and that I needed to confirm any sector change through command. He nodded once. "We'll be ahead of you." Then all 4 crossed back into the trees. By the time Kira reached me, their lights were already climbing the East Fork. I told her what they had said. She looked past me at the lights. They never checked in. I know. I keyed my radio. Base Navarro, confirming county team operating East Fork, 4 personnel. The reply came almost immediately. Negative, no county team assigned East Fork. I looked at Kira. I asked command to verify with the sheriff's office. There was a pause. Then, confirmed. No second team in your drainage. We did not jump to ghosts. Our first thought was unauthorized volunteers. Our second was a neighboring jurisdiction operating without coordination. Our third was that command was wrong. All 3 were more reasonable than anything else. Kira and I walked back to the creek crossing where I had spoken with them. The mud there was soft enough to hold the edges of my boots. My tracks were obvious. Kira's earlier tracks were visible farther back. There were no others. We checked both sides of the crossing. Nothing. 4 people with loaded packs had stood less than 10 feet from me, and the ground did not show a single additional print. That was the first moment I stopped trying to make the facts fit easily. Kira said, "We stay on Weller." She was right. Whatever the 4 people were, Thomas was still missing. We moved back to the west side and resumed searching where the real sign had taken us. 20 minutes later, Kira found a strip of bright yellow fabric snagged low on a broken branch. Thomas's brother had sent us a photo of his pack. The rain cover in the picture was the same color. 100 yards beyond that, I found a clearer boot impression heading west and uphill. Physical evidence. Not a voice. Not a story from strangers. We marked it and followed. For the next hour, the west slope gave us just enough to keep going. A scuffed patch where somebody had stepped off the trail, a bent stem at knee height, then another impression protected beneath a fir. None of those signs would have meant much by themselves. Together, and in the same line of travel, they mattered. We radioed each useful point back to command. That was important. If weather or darkness forced us out, another team needed to be able to restart from evidence rather than from our memory. At first light, command called us back to consolidate. By the time we reached the trailhead, I was tired enough to resent the delay. We had a direction now, and every minute spent explaining the 4 people felt like time taken from Thomas. Then, our incident commander, Paul Henley, asked me to describe the searchers again. When I mentioned the external frame packs and the long radio antenna, an older county coordinator named Ray Sutter stopped what he was doing. He asked, "Orange vests?" I said yes. "Canvas gaiters on one of them?" I looked at Kira. "Yes." Ray walked to his vehicle and came back with a tablet. He had pulled up a scanned incident file from the county archive. The first page was a photograph. 4 search and rescue volunteers stood beside an old utility truck. Same leader, same woman, same 2 men, same equipment. The photograph was dated October 1989. For a few seconds, I tried to convince myself that I was matching general faces to a bad picture. Then I saw the leader's vest. There was a small rectangular patch stitched crookedly over the right chest. I had noticed it when he unfolded his map. The patch in the photograph was crooked in exactly the same way. Ray said all 4 had disappeared during a search 37 years earlier. The subject that year had been another adult backpacker, The four-person county team entered the drainage overnight after reporting possible sign in the East Fork. The missing backpacker was found alive the following morning near the lower trail system. He had never gone into the East Fork. The SAR team had. Nobody ever found them. No bodies, no packs, no damaged equipment, no accident site. The file had one detail that mattered more than the photograph. Before they vanished, the 1989 team had radioed that they had located fresh tracks they believed belonged to their missing subject. Those tracks were in the East Fork. Once the subject was recovered elsewhere, investigators knew the tracks could not have been his. The old team had followed them anyway. Paul closed the file and looked at me. We are not changing the current search based on anything you heard east of the creek. I said, agreed. That was the right decision, and it was not difficult, because Thomas had left us evidence. By late morning, Kira and I were back on the west slope with a third ranger farther behind us for support. We found the lower section of Thomas's yellow rain cover tangled in brush. Then one half of a trekking pole, broken below the grip. Above it, the slope steepened. There were slide marks in loose soil, then disturbed vegetation running downslope toward a cluster of rock and fallen timber. The shape of the search changed immediately. We were no longer looking for somebody walking off route. We were looking for somebody who had fallen. We slowed down and worked the slope carefully. By late afternoon, clouds had moved back over the basin, and the light was going flat. That was when the four lights appeared again. They were across the drainage. Same spacing, same slow movement through the trees. Kira saw them at the same time I did. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. Then my radio crackled. The voice was clearer this time. The old team leader said, "Navarro, we've got Weller ahead of us." I felt something tighten in my stomach. I had never given that man my surname. Before I could answer, a voice came from the East Fork. "Help!" It was faint, but unmistakably human. Kira turned toward the creek. The voice came again. "Help me," she said. "You heard that?" "Yes." Our evidence was west of us. The voice was east. That was the decision the whole search came down to. If we crossed the creek because of that voice, we would abandon every physical sign Thomas had left. We would also be doing exactly what the 1989 team had done. I keyed my radio and called Thomas's name toward the west slope. Nothing. I moved 20 yards lower and called again. A weak answer came back, not from the east, from below us. "Here!" Kira pointed downslope. We called again. The response shifted naturally as we moved, getting clearer through the trees. That is what a real voice does. We found Thomas wedged beneath the broken trunk of a spruce at the bottom of a short rock drop. He had injured one leg and could not climb out. He was cold, dehydrated, and exhausted, but conscious. His pack was still with him, one shoulder strap torn where he had gone through the brush. The satellite messenger was in a side pocket with a cracked screen. He told us he had tried it after the fall and could not get it to power on. Kira took the medical lead while I radioed our position. We insulated him from the ground, checked circulation below the injury, gave him small amounts of water, and kept him still until the litter team could reach us. Nothing about that part was mysterious. It was exactly the kind of problem we had expected to find when the West Side evidence started dropping downhill. The first thing I asked Thomas after we stabilized him was whether he had crossed to the East Fork at any point. He looked confused. No. Not yesterday, not earlier. No, I slipped coming off the West Side. He had never been near the place where the 4 searchers said they had found his trail. We radioed the find and started preparing him for extraction. It took time to move him safely. The light was almost gone when Kira looked across the drainage again. The 4 searchers were standing among the trees on the east side, not hiding, not approaching, just there. The leader raised one arm. It looked less like a wave than a signal to follow. Then he turned. The other 3 turned with him. One by one, their lights moved deeper into the East Fork until the timber swallowed them. Kira watched the last light disappear. She said, "They really think they found him." I remember that sentence because it was worse than saying they were trying to lure us. A lure has intent. What I saw on that slope looked like people still doing the job they had started 37 years earlier. We got Thomas out after midnight. 2 days later, after I had slept enough to read without losing my place, I asked Ray for the complete 1989 file. Most of it was routine. Maps, weather notes, interview summaries, search assignments. Near the end was a transcript of the missing team's final radio transmission. It had been logged shortly after 2 in the morning. The team leader said, "Base, we have visual on another search party farther up the drainage. 4 personnel. They're telling us they've found the subject. We're moving to them now." There had been no other search party deployed in that drainage in 1989. The 4 people I met had not necessarily started whatever happened there. 37 years earlier, they had seen another team, and they had followed it east. The park never found a useful explanation for what Kira and I saw. There were no new footprints. No unauthorized group came forward. Nothing showed on the trailhead cameras. The county confirmed again that none of its active volunteers matched the people we described, and nobody had signed out the kind of old radio equipment I remembered. The East Fork was not closed. We had one impossible encounter, one old file, and no hazard we could define in a way that would help the public. Thomas recovered. The old file went back into the archive. For a while, I convinced myself that was where the story ended. A few months later, I was working a completely different search in another part of the park. Daylight operation, good weather, plenty of radio traffic. I was standing beside a trail junction when my handheld picked up a faint transmission beneath the normal channel. A male voice said, 4 moving east. Same cadence, same voice. I changed channels. It was gone. The first rifle was lying in the middle of the trail. It was a good hunting rifle with an expensive scope, loaded, undamaged, and dry. About 400 yards farther down the drainage, I found the second one. After that came a pack, then a coat, then one boot. By the time I found Ross Danner, he had run almost 3 miles through steep timber with nothing in his hands. He was sitting beneath a fallen tree and would not come out. The first thing he asked me was whether the elk was still where they had shot it. When I said I did not know, he told me not to go back and check. I had been a state game warden for 12 years by then. I had dealt with armed poachers, wounded bears, illegal bait sites, spotlighting crews, people who lied badly, and people who lied well. What happened in that drainage did not fit any of them. The call came in a little after 4 on a cold November afternoon. A resident on the Lower Forest Road had reported 2 rifle shots from a drainage that had been closed to hunting for the season because of a habitat restriction. The area was rough enough that most people stayed on the main road unless they had a reason to be there, and the old spur into the upper basin had been closed to motorized traffic for years. I expected an ordinary poaching case. 2 hunters, maybe an elk down where they should not have been, maybe an ATV where it did not belong. I drove in alone because that was normal for the first response. Another conservation officer, Tara Quinn, was working more than an hour away. I told dispatch where I was going, gave them the vehicle description from the reporting party, and headed up the forest road. The pickup was easy to find. It was parked nose in beside the old spur with no one around it. 2 rifle cases lay open in the bed. The tailgate was down. Fresh ATV tracks crossed the berm and continued beyond the motorized closure sign. That told me 2 things. First, whoever was up there was not making much effort to hide what they were doing. Second, they expected to come back quickly. I photographed the truck, radioed the plate, and followed the spur on foot. About a mile in, I found the ATV. It was stopped crooked across the trail. The keys were still in it. A pair of boot tracks left the machine and continued uphill into the drainage. For the first 100 yards, the tracks looked normal. Then the stride length changed. Both men had started running. You can read panic in tracks long before you ever see the person who made them. Heel strikes dig deeper. Toes throw dirt backward. People stop choosing easy footing and start cutting straight through brush. That was what these tracks did. The first thing I found was a pack, not dropped neatly, thrown. A spotting scope came next, still in its padded case. Then one of the rifles. It was lying directly in the trail, safety on, magazine loaded. That got my attention. Hunters abandon a lot of things when they are scared. A loaded rifle is usually not one of them. Farther down, the tracks split briefly around a patch of deadfall and came together again. Then I found the second rifle. After that, a heavy canvas coat. Then, almost half a mile farther, a single boot. The man who had lost it kept running. I slowed down. Not because I was frightened yet, because I no longer knew what kind of scene I was walking into. An armed confrontation did not fit. Both rifles were behind me. An injury did not fit either. The tracks were too fast and too sustained. I checked the surrounding ground and started noticing something else. Elk tracks. A lot of them. A herd had moved through the drainage downhill, fast enough to tear up soft soil near the creek. That by itself was not remarkable. Elk move for all kinds of reasons. Then I found black bear tracks crossing the same slope. Those were also headed out. Not feeding, not circling, leaving. I marked the location and kept going. Ross Danner was under a wind-thrown spruce nearly 3 miles from the ATV. I saw his boot first, the one he still had on. He had crawled beneath the trunk where the root ball had lifted enough earth to make a shallow cavity. When I called out, he did not answer. I identified myself. Still nothing. Then I saw his face through the branches. He knew exactly who I was. That mattered, because a poacher who had just dumped 2 rifles usually had plenty of reasons not to be happy to see a game warden. Ross looked relieved. He crawled out slowly, hands visible. His face was scratched. One pant leg was torn. He was breathing hard despite the fact that he had clearly been sitting there for a while. He kept looking uphill. I asked where the other man was. "Clay. Where is he?" Ross swallowed. "I don't know." Then he asked, "Did you see it?" I said, "See what?" He looked past me. "The elk. Is it still up there?" I told him I had not seen any carcass. He shook his head once. "Don't go back." I asked whether anyone was injured. "No." "Did somebody threaten you?" "No." "Bear?" He hesitated too long. Then said, "I don't know." Ross Danner was 45. He had been hunting most of his life. He knew the difference between a bear, a mountain lion, an elk crashing through timber, and wind-moving trees. He was also illegally hunting in a closed drainage, so I did not take his story at face value. But I listened. He said he and Clay Vickers had ridden the ATV to the lower drainage, then walked into the elk meadow. They found a mature bull near the edge of the upper basin. Ross fired first. The elk went down. They waited, then started toward it. That was when the drainage changed. The first thing Ross noticed was the birds. They stopped, not gradually. 1 minute there were jays in the timber and smaller birds moving along the creek. Then there were none. At almost the same time, elk started coming out of the upper basin. Not the bull they had shot. Other elk, cows, calves, another smaller bull. They moved downhill through the timber in a loose line, not toward the dead animal and not toward Ross and Clay. Away from the basin. Ross assumed a bear had moved in. That would have made sense. A bear on a fresh kill can change the behavior of everything nearby. The 2 men backed off and returned to the ATV for game bags and a frame pack. When they came back, the bull was gone. The blood was still there. The place where the elk had fallen was still flattened. But the animal itself had disappeared. They found the drag trail almost immediately. It went uphill. That was the first part of Ross's story that I had trouble accepting. A mature bull elk is not light. Dragging one downhill is hard. Dragging one uphill through timber takes enormous strength. Ross and Clay followed the blood because, in Ross's words, we weren't leaving that animal. That statement did more to convince me he was telling at least part of the truth than anything else. He was admitting motive against his own interest. They followed the drag trail maybe 200 yards. Then something moved behind them, heavy. Not a footstep, a push through vegetation. They turned and saw nothing. A few seconds later, the same kind of movement came from their left. Then uphill again. Ross thought bear. Clay thought maybe another elk. Then a young pine 20 yards away snapped hard enough that both of them heard the trunk crack. Ross fired a warning shot into the ground. The movement stopped. For several seconds, Nothing happened. Then something hit the timber much closer. Ross described it as a body impact, not a branch falling, not a rock, a heavy strike against brush and saplings that made the whole patch jump. That was when they started backing out. Clay fired once uphill. Another impact came almost immediately from the same direction as the shot. Closer. Ross said, "It wasn't scared of the rifle." Then he corrected himself. No, it was coming to the rifle. They ran. Ross dropped his first, because every time metal clacked against a branch, or the sling hardware knocked the stock, movement shifted toward him. Clay kept his longer. Then Clay fired again somewhere lower in the drainage. Ross heard the shot, then heard timber break toward it. Clay dropped his rifle too. After that, they stopped trying to stay together. They were just trying to get out. I asked Ross where he last saw Clay. He pointed downstream. Near the old line shack. I knew the structure he meant. It was an old maintenance cabin left from a road project decades earlier. One room, metal roof, heavy wooden door. I radioed Ross's location, told dispatch I had one subject alive and uninjured enough to walk, and requested Tara move toward the lower access. Ross did not want to go back toward the drainage. I told him he did not have to. I walked him down to a place where another officer could meet him, then continued toward the line shack. By then, it was almost dark. I found Clay before full night. The door was barricaded from the inside. I could hear him moving around. I knocked and identified myself. He yelled, "Say your name." "Cal Mercer." Silence. Then, "Game warden?" "Yes." The barricade moved. Clay opened the door only far enough to look at me. He was missing one boot. His sock was black with mud. He let me in and immediately closed the door behind me. The interior smelled like dust, wet clothing, and old wood. Clay had shoved a bench and a broken shelf against the entrance. I asked why. He said, "Because it followed me down." His account matched Ross's on the parts that mattered. The silence, the elk leaving, the bull gone, the drag trail uphill, the movement after the shots. But Clay had seen one thing Ross had not. He had looked back while running. He did not see an animal. He saw young trees bending apart one after another, not shaking randomly, opening. A line of movement came through the timber at about chest height and higher. Branches snapped as it passed. For a moment, Clay thought he would see a bear step into the gap. Nothing did. The vegetation simply kept parting toward him. That was when he lost his boot. I asked how large the thing was. Clay shook his head. "I didn't see it." "You saw what it moved." "Yes." "How high?" He looked at the cabin wall, measuring from memory. "Higher than me." Clay was not small. I got both men out that night. Their rifles stayed where they had dropped them. So did the elk. That decision was not fear. It was procedure. Dark timber, unknown wildlife hazard, 2 frightened subjects, and no immediate need to recover evidence before daylight. The next morning, Tara Quinn met me at the spur. We went back in. Tara had been a conservation officer almost as long as I had been a warden. She knew predator sign better than most people I worked with. We recovered both rifles first. Neither had been damaged. Ross's was exactly where I found it the night before. Clay's was farther down. Then we followed their tracks back toward the elk meadow. The first thing Tara said when we reached the kill site was, "He wasn't lying about the bull." There was enough blood and hair to establish where the elk had fallen. The drag trail left the site clearly. Uphill. We followed it. The ground was disturbed in places where something heavy had been pulled over roots and rocks. I kept looking for bear tracks. Tara did too. We found none. We found elk tracks leaving, bear tracks leaving, 2 sets of coyote tracks moving downhill. What we did not find were tracks coming in. The trail camera we later pulled from the lower meadow made the sequence even stranger. At 4:11, elk moved out. At 4:19, a black bear crossed downhill. At 4:27, 2 coyotes trotted through in the same direction. After that, the camera recorded empty frames. No predator, no person, nothing. We found the bull in a small opening above the meadow. It had been dragged deep enough into timber that I doubt Ross and Clay would have located it again in the dark. There was nothing ritualistic about the carcass, nothing arranged, nothing cut in an impossible way. It was simply dead, but almost nothing had fed on it. No ravens overhead, no coyote sign around the body, no bear disturbance. That bothered me more than visible damage would have. A fresh elk in that part of the state should attract attention quickly. This one sat in the open, like the rest of the drainage had decided it was not worth approaching. Around the carcass, the vegetation was heavily compressed. Brush lay flattened in several directions. One root had been torn partly out of the ground. Bark was scraped high on 2 trunks. The duff had deep depressions, but no print I could read as a paw, hoof, or boot. Tara walked a slow circle and finally said, "I can tell you something heavy was here." "That's all I've got too." We documented the scene, collected hair and blood from the elk, photographed the drag path, recovered shell casings where Ross and Clay said they had fired. Every practical piece of their story checked out. We were almost finished when something moved uphill. One heavy push through brush, then silence. Tara looked at me. I raised a hand. We listened. Nothing. A few seconds later, the sound came lower and farther left. Not rushing, repositioning. The wind was weak. The trees around us were barely moving. Then a young pine about 30 yards away bent sideways. Not from the top, from the middle. It leaned, held for a second, then snapped back. Neither of us saw what touched it. Tara reached for the metal evidence case beside her. The latch struck the side with a sharp clank. Something hit the timber uphill. Hard. Exactly the way Ross had described. Tara froze. I understood then why 2 men carrying rifles had dropped them. Noise was not warning it away. Noise was giving it something to move toward. I said quietly, "We're leaving." Tara nodded. No argument. No attempt to get a better look. We packed only what we already had in hand and started back toward the creek. Halfway down, elk exploded through the trees behind us. 5 or 6 of them, maybe more. They came downhill at full speed, crashing through brush close enough that Tara and I both stepped off the trail to avoid them. They did not slow when they saw us. They did not care about us. They were running from something behind us. That removed the last reasonable doubt I had about whether the drainage itself had simply felt wrong because of Ross's story. Something was moving into that basin, and the wildlife knew before we did. We kept walking. The heavy movement followed. Sometimes uphill, sometimes off to one side, never directly charging. That was almost worse. It felt like pressure, like being pushed. At the creek crossing, I looked back once. Several trunks stood close together on the far bank. Behind them, brush opened. For maybe 1 second, I saw enough movement to understand scale. Not a shape I could identify. Just mass. Height. Branches parting behind the trees as something passed through without giving me a full view. Then it stopped. Tara said, "Cal." I turned. We crossed the creek. The moment we reached the lower side of the drainage, the movement ended. Not faded, ended. No more broken branches. No more heavy pushes through brush. Nothing followed us farther. The poaching case itself stayed simple. Ross Danner and Clay Vickers were charged with the illegal kill, unlawful motorized access, and the related violations. Neither tried to use what happened as an excuse. Ross paid what he owed. Clay barely spoke about it again. I filed a wildlife hazard note because, whatever else I believed, something large and unidentified had occupied that drainage and displaced other animals. We returned once later with a larger group. We found no unknown predator, no den, no unusual tracks, no carcass besides the elk. Nothing that gave the incident a clean explanation. Over the next few months, the wildlife cameras started showing normal activity again. Elk returned. Coyotes came through. A black bear crossed the lower meadow twice. The drainage looked ordinary. I almost convinced myself that whatever had been there had moved on. Then, late the following summer, I reviewed a camera card from the same basin. The camera had audio. At 1:17 in the morning, it recorded a distant rifle shot. No hunter appeared in frame. The next clips showed elk leaving, then coyotes, then a black bear moving downhill at a run. After that, the camera recorded nothing but empty timber. No creature ever appeared. It did not have to. By then, I understood what the empty forest meant. Something was coming in. Martin Creek Ranger Station had been empty for 23 years. I knew that because I carried the key to the padlock. There was no power to the building, no propane service, no caretaker, and no reason for anyone to be staying there. The first time I went inside, the wood stove was warm. There was coffee in a metal cup beside the desk. That bothered me. What bothered me more was the map underneath it. It had been printed from our district office less than 3 months earlier. Somebody had marked my patrol route on it, not the routes generally assigned to my position. Mine, including the road I had driven that morning. My name is Grant Ellison. I was 42 then, working recreation and wilderness patrol for the Forest Service in northern Idaho. Most of my job was ordinary. Trailheads, dispersed camps, seasonal gates, backcountry structures, checking permit areas, helping with searches when the district needed another person who knew the roads. Martin Creek was one of those places I checked because somebody had to. The station sat about 14 miles from the main district road. You reached it by turning off at a ridge turnout, following an old access road down through timber, and stopping where the road ended in a small clearing beside the creek. It was not much of a building, a covered porch, a front room that had once been used as an office, a small bunk room, a wood stove, shelves, old cabinets, and one desk facing the windows. The Forest Service had staffed it decades earlier, back when one ranger might spend days working from a remote station instead of driving in from the district office. Eventually, roads improved. Operations consolidated. Martin Creek stopped being practical. The district kept the building because it still had some value as an emergency shelter, and because nobody wanted to be the person who recommended tearing down a piece of local history. But nobody worked there, not anymore. I first noticed something wrong in late October. I had been checking 2 dispersed camps farther up the ridge and was coming back later than I wanted. It was already dark when I passed the turnout above Martin Creek. Through the trees below, I saw a small amber light in one of the station windows. I slowed down. At that distance, it looked exactly like a lantern. My first thought was trespasser. Hunters occasionally used closed structures if they thought nobody was checking. Usually it was harmless until it became somebody damaging a door or leaving trash. I turned onto the access road and drove down. By the time I reached the clearing, the station was dark. No vehicle, no fresh tire tracks. I got out with my flashlight and checked the building. The district padlock was still on the front door, windows intact, no sound inside. I walked around once and found nothing. The only thing I could think was that I had seen a reflection from my own headlights through the trees, or maybe another flashlight farther down the creek. Neither explanation was good, but both were possible. So I left. 4 days later, I passed Martin Creek in daylight. This time, I saw smoke. Thin gray chimney smoke rising above the roof. There was no mistaking that for a reflection. I turned in immediately. Again, no vehicle. No tracks except mine from the previous visit. The padlock was still in place. I unlocked the door and went inside. The building smelled different. Not abandoned building damp. Wood smoke. Recent wood smoke. I touched the stove carefully. Warm. Not hot enough for an active fire, but somebody had burned wood in it recently. There was a metal cup on the desk with coffee still in the bottom. Cold by then, but not dried out. The bunk in the back room had been made neatly with an old wool blanket. Beside the stove was a stack of split firewood. That was what made the whole thing stranger. A trespasser usually leaves evidence of being a trespasser. Trash, food wrappers, mud, gear. Somebody using Martin Creek had left it looking like a ranger had stepped out during a workday. I photographed everything. My first explanation was a copied key. The district had existed long enough that there could easily have been keys floating around from former employees. I called our office and asked whether facilities had sent anyone out. No. Fire crew? No. Wildlife? No. Contractor? No, nobody was authorized to be there. I removed the cup and the bedding, cleared the ash from the stove, and locked the building again. 2 days later, a facilities employee named Aaron Pike came out with me. Aaron was the kind of person who distrusted mysterious explanations on principle. That was one reason I wanted him there. We checked the door hardware, hinges, windows, foundation vents, roof access. There was no hidden rear entrance and no basement. The chimney was too narrow to be useful to anyone except a raccoon with bad judgment. Aaron changed the padlock anyway. He also put a small numbered inspection seal across the door frame. If the door opened, the seal would break. We removed the remaining bedding, swept the stove, and left the interior bare enough that new use would be obvious. Aaron said, "If somebody comes back now, we'll know how." A week later, I drove down alone. The seal was intact. So was the new padlock. I remember standing on the porch, looking at both of them for longer than I should have. Then I unlocked the door. There was firewood stacked beside the stove again. A different metal cup sat on the desk. The bunk had been made. The stove contained fresh ash. And underneath the cup was a map. At first I assumed it was one of the old maps stored in the cabinets. Then I saw the printing. It was a current district map. The roads had the latest seasonal status marks. A trail reroute completed that summer was already shown. One closure from the previous spring had been removed. The map could not have been old. Several lines had been drawn on it in pencil. They followed roads and trails I had driven or walked over the previous 2 weeks. Not generally. Exactly. One line showed my loop through the Hayden Ridge trailheads. Another followed an old logging road where I had checked an illegal campsite. A third marked a short spur I had taken only because I noticed a damaged gate while driving past. My route that morning came down the ridge road and ended at Martin Creek. No words, no threat, no note, just work. That made it worse. If somebody had written my name across the map or drawn something dramatic, I could have treated it like harassment. This looked like somebody documenting my patrols, the way I documented my own. I called the district office from the clearing. The map series had been printed that summer for several programs, but distribution was limited to employees and a few partner agencies. My own copy was still rolled behind the seat of my truck. This was another one. Aaron came back out. So did my supervisor. We treated it as a security issue. Nobody wanted to say anything more than that. The key inventory showed no obvious missing copies. The newer padlock had only 2 current keys. Aaron had one. I had the other. We checked the building again. Nothing. The district considered boarding the door, but Martin Creek still technically served as an emergency shelter. So instead, we added a trail camera aimed directly at the porch and entrance. It was not hidden. That was intentional. If a person was using the station, we wanted them to know we were watching the door. For the next 6 days, the camera recorded exactly what it should have. A doe crossing the clearing, snow flurries, a raven on the porch railing, me arriving to check the station. Nobody else. Inside, the stove had been used again. The cup was gone. Another one had replaced it. The bunk was made. The map was back on the desk. That was when the problem stopped being a question of copied keys. There was no camera failure. No missing block of time. Nobody crossed the porch. Nobody opened the door. yet somebody had been inside. I stopped going to Martin Creek casually. If I had to pass the turnout, I looked down at the clearing. Sometimes the building was dark. Once I thought I saw smoke, but by then I no longer trusted myself at a distance. Then the map changed again. Dispatch redirected me halfway through a morning patrol because a contractor reported a fallen tree blocking a small road south of the ridge. That road had not been on my schedule. I did not decide to take it. I did not tell anyone except dispatch that I was going there. After clearing the report, I continued toward Martin Creek because the station was already on my inspection list. The new pencil line on the map included the contractor road, that morning's road. It ended where my truck sat outside. I stood in the office looking at the line and realized whoever was using that station was not working from my weekly assignment sheet. It knew where I had actually been. That was when I started looking backward, instead of only at the building. I pulled old records. The last regular ranger assigned to Martin Creek had been a man named Walter Keene. He was 44 when he disappeared. Late 1990s. Experienced. No disciplinary history. No obvious reason to vanish voluntarily. One autumn morning, Walter left Martin Creek on what should have been a routine patrol. His government truck was later found farther up a service road. Locked. Some gear still inside. Search teams covered the surrounding country. No body, no accident site, no confirmed sign beyond the truck. He was never found. Martin Creek remained in occasional use after his disappearance. That part interested me more. Old maintenance notes contain small references that were easy to miss if you were not looking for them. Smoke reported during a week when nobody was scheduled there. Lantern light seen during a storm. Supplies moved between visits. A note about firewood being used faster than expected. Nothing was treated as paranormal. Nobody launched an investigation. They just used the building less. Eventually, almost nobody used it at all. I called a retired employee named Frank Dorsey, who had worked the district around that time. I asked him if people had ever had trouble with trespassers at Martin Creek. He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, "You seeing smoke?" I asked why he said that. Because that's what people used to see. Was somebody breaking in? Another pause. If you saw smoke, don't assume somebody broke in. I said, "Were things stolen?" "No." "What happened?" Frank said. "Things got used." That was all he wanted to say. No legend. No story about Walter walking through walls. Just that. Things got used. Early November brought our first real snow. One afternoon, I drove past the Martin Creek turnout without stopping. Fresh snow covered the access road. No tire tracks, no footprints. I went several miles farther, checked a trail closure, then looped back on the same road. Smoke was coming from the station chimney. I stopped at the turnout. The access road was still untouched. No tracks went down. Nobody could have driven past me. Nobody could have walked into that clearing without leaving a line in the snow. I did not go in. That was the first time I deliberately left the station alone. 3 days later, weather forced the issue. A storm came in earlier and harder than forecast. I was finishing a late patrol north of the ridge when snow started covering the road faster than the plows could reach that section. Then a tree came down behind me. I could not safely reverse around it, and the road ahead was getting worse. Martin Creek was the nearest hardened shelter. I radioed dispatch, gave them my position, and told them I would shelter at the station until daylight. That decision bothered me, but it was still the correct decision. Being afraid of a building is not a reason to drive an unsafe mountain road in a snowstorm. When I reached the access road, I saw the station before I reached the clearing. Lantern light in the window, steady smoke from the chimney. The front door was unlocked. Not broken, unlocked. I went inside. The stove was burning. Coffee sat in the same kind of metal cup. The bunk was made. A current map lay open on the desk. The pencil line for that day followed my patrol exactly. It ended at Martin Creek. Not near it, at it. As though somebody had known I would spend the night there before I did. I shut the door. I remember thinking that if there was a person inside, I would rather deal with a person than keep pretending the station was empty. I checked the bunk room, cabinets, behind the stove. Nobody. Then a chair moved, a short wooden scrape across the floor behind me. I turned. A man was sitting at the desk. I cannot tell you how he got there. I had been facing that desk less than 10 seconds earlier. He looked ordinary, middle-aged, average build, an old Forest Service-style work shirt under a darker jacket, heavy boots. His back was mostly toward me. Snow or melted snow darkened the shoulders of his jacket. He was looking down at the map. I said, "Who are you?" He did not answer. He put one finger on the map, then asked, "You still taking the North Road tomorrow?" His voice was calm, not threatening. The kind of question one employee might ask another while planning the next day. I said, "How did you get in here?" He kept studying the map. Then he said, "You missed the lower gate last Thursday." I had meant to check it and got pulled to another call. It bothered me enough that I had written myself a reminder later that night. Nobody outside the district would have cared. I took one step toward him. "Turn around!" A sound came from the porch. A dull thump, like somebody knocking snow off a boot. I looked at the door. Maybe 1 second. When I looked back, the chair was empty. I searched the room immediately. Then the bunk room. Then outside. Fresh snow covered the clearing. My tracks came from the truck to the porch. Nothing else approached. Nothing left. I did not sleep. I could not leave safely, so I stayed. That was worse than if the man had chased me. There was nowhere rational to go. I kept the stove going because freezing to prove a point would have been stupid. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps cross the porch. Slow, heavy boots. They stopped outside the door. The handle never moved. Later I heard the same dull sound I had heard earlier, snow being knocked from soles. At some point, the stove shifted behind me. The fire had burned low. A log settled, I told myself. Then another piece of wood dropped into place. I did not turn around immediately. When I finally did, the fire was burning higher. The door was still closed. Just before dawn, I checked the map again. My route from the previous day remained marked. Beside the North Road, the road I had actually been scheduled to patrol that morning, there was another pencil line. A route I had not taken yet. I folded the map and put it inside my jacket. When the storm eased enough to move safely, I left. I did not take the North Road. The district sent people back to Martin Creek later. They found nothing conclusive, no hidden access, no unexplained tracks, no person. We removed anything useful from the building and secured it more aggressively. I requested that I not work the Martin Creek route alone. Nobody argued. I finished the season. By spring, I had mostly stopped thinking about the station every day. Then one afternoon, I was inside the main district office when an old radio frequency opened over the speaker. Static first, then a man's voice, ordinary, calm. Martin Creek, in service. The dispatcher looked up. Somebody said it was probably an old radio being tested somewhere. Martin Creek had not been an active station in more than 20 years. The voice came again. Starting north patrol. That was the road drawn on the map before I left the station. Nobody answered. I didn't either.